Hey guys, how's it going? It is the old fat guy with you today, and today is a special day for me because I get to interview a very good friend of mine named Chris Clasby. He is the peer advocacy coordinator, is that correct? Am I
Yep,
okay?
yep.
At Summit Independent Living Center. And uh, why don't you just give us a quick introduction, Chris, and what that is and what that means and what you do, and we'll go from there.
All right. So for a lot of people who are not familiar with the terms or the compound term independent living, um, formally it's uh, independent living is kind of a movement of support and self-determination for individuals with all types of disabilities. And going back a long ways, there have been what are called Centers for Independent Living across the United States. They're federally funded and exist no matter where a person lives in the US. Uh, there is a Center for Independent Living that is charged with providing services, specific services to individuals with any type of disability, um, to be able to live as independently as possible. One of those mandated services is called peer advocacy or peer support, based on the idea that uh, when an individual has a disability or experiences disability and needs information or help with adjustment or whatever, it is often the experience and knowledge of another individual with a disability who is most helpful. So that's kind of just in a nutshell what independent living is and what my specific title and role is there.
Now, we're going to transition eventually into being more specific toward mental health, but I want to kind of clarify a couple of things. I just lost my flipping thought, man. Um, so let's talk for just a minute about the word disability because there is a segment that understands disability as something that's permanent and continuous and you have it all the time or you don't. And then there is a disabling condition like MS that is a disability, but it is um, not predictable and it doesn't happen all the time. And mental health kind of fits into that latter role. Um, does independent living philosophy have any fundamental changes between permanent physical disabilities and invisible um, conditions that may or may not be going on?
Uh, Not really. I think the big difference between uh, traditional, I guess, thought about disability and labeling or diagnosing of a disability is that independent living doesn't look at another person or a professional's opinion about whether or not a disability exists, but rather relies on the individual experiencing a condition to report whether or not they identify as being affected by a disability. So somebody who self-identifies as having MS would say, or having MS and having functional limitations caused by MS would say that exactly. I have difficulty getting to a bus stop, for example, because my mobility is impaired or whatever. So it really doesn't matter what another person says. And if somebody walks in the front door of a Center for Independent Living or comes in however they get there and requests services and self-identifies as having a disability, boom, that's it. They qualify. They're eligible. We don't ask for somebody else's diagnostic opinion. So I
So,
guess sorry, that kind of just a lagging thought to more directly answer your question. At one point in somebody's life who's experiencing MS, for example, they might identify as having a disability. Yet at another time, if they're not being affected by it, they may not identify. Although the the existence of whatever has caused MS is still there.
well, let
So,
me let me explain why I phrase that question the way that I do from the sense of mental health. Because when, I remember back in the bad days, when you're filling out paperwork for benefits, you're asked by the social worker, tell me how your disability affects blah, blah, blah. And for somebody that has, long term mental health issues, though it's not, how do you say this? Um, like I said, I view it as a disabling condition. There are times certainly where my mental health issues have kept me from maintaining full-time employment. You're one of the few employers that I can count on one hand that didn't fire me for one reason or another. That is directly related to symptoms of what I deal with. Um, but you know me well enough to know that probably at least 70% of the time, I don't deal with those issues. And so that, um, so we're trying to figure out how independent living philosophy ties into mental health when a person is well 70% or more of the time. And there's really no difference, is is what I hear you saying.
right. And I think um, also we need to realize that the federal definition, for what that's worth, of disability, uh, for example, to be protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the largest legislation that's ever happened for people with disability. Um, somebody who, or excuse me, disability is defined as something that exists, a person who has a condition that exists or has a history of that condition existing is eligible under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So, for example, somebody who has a childhood seizure disorder, but yet they age out of it, say at puberty or whatever, never experience any kind of convulsion, anything again. But the history of having had that condition as a child is enough to say, yeah, that person meets this category. Now, in different um, eligibility categories, that might not be the same. So, for example, somebody who qualifies for Social Security disability may at one point in their life have the inability to work and earn income by working, yet their condition may improve so that they are able to work. So, in the first situation, they may be eligible for services and benefits, but in the latter condition, even though they have the history, so the disability is still exists, they don't qualify for the benefits.
Right. And I also understand that that ends up being different from different agencies. For instance, vocational rehabilitation services are on a state by state basis,
Yes,
whereas SSDI is a federal issue. So um, I know, for instance, in our state, and I don't know if this is still going on, but for a time, the budget was such that they had to tier the disabilities, and so there were people that were federally eligible for SSI or SSDI, but they weren't eligible for VR services because they didn't meet that tier.
correct. And it's interesting that you bring that up because I just had this question posed to me the other day, which, not to get too deep into it, but um, the uh, Federal Civil Rights Act of 1973 mandated that any building or service, etc., that is funded even partially by federal funds must be accessible to and usable by individuals with disabilities. And so, since the Federal Civil Rights Act was passed, I mean, if somebody's, let's say a community's building a bridge, for example, that's got sidewalks, if the money paying for that bridge, if a dollar of it comes from a federal source, that bridge, those sidewalks, by law, must be accessible.
Okay,
And
but
so,
let's talk about that by law for just a minute because uh, I'm a little bit of a cynic, and the law can be bullshit. And the law is that the ADA is that all federal buildings have to be accessible. That would include post offices. I have been to a post office 20 years after the ADA was passed in Tennessee where there was no wheelchair, a person in a wheelchair could not access that post office. So I appreciate that that law has been around for 50 years, the civil rights law that you just quoted, but it still doesn't mean a hill of beans, really, does it?
um, I, yeah, and I totally agree with what you're saying. Um, I think it's important because, and it does account for something because it gives somebody the basis or the support of filing a complaint and hopefully advocating for change that will has happened and hopefully will happen. I agree. I agree with you entirely. Somebody who you and I both know, uh, has said to me a lot of times that there's no ADA police. And what he means by that is, you know, if nobody knows about it, nobody enforces it,
But
you know.
that's just not only the ADA. I mean,
Right.
there's
Yeah, yeah.
you know, there's just because insider trading is illegal doesn't mean it doesn't happen. You know,
Right. And if nobody complains about it,
right?
or,
Or nobody knows about it. You
yeah,
know,
if nobody makes other people
aware.
aware of it,
Exactly.
then that's like, well,
So
it's
let's
just,
go back to something you said earlier about independent living philosophy, and that is self determination. And that, I think, is one of the foundations of independent living philosophy. And I think that there are a lot of myths perpetuated because of that being a foundation. And you're in a little bit of a unique perspective because you technically are a mental health professional. You're a licensed clinical social worker, but you you fully embrace independent living philosophy, and sometimes there are those that view that as being contradictory principles. So I'm going to kind of put you on the hot seat here a little bit in terms of self determination. And we're going to talk about RAP eventually, but on the back of the RAP book, there's, I think it's called the Bill of Rights of Disabilities or something to that effect. And one of those rights is that I have the right to choose my own reality. And I don't know if that's exactly how it's worded, but that's the gist of the right. And so I'm just going to use my own personal experience and the and put the opposing argument to why that's contrary to mental health. I have some, I don't know where this fits in the DSM, but there are times where I misinterpret what somebody's saying to me. And I don't know if it's because they twitch their eyebrow the wrong way or there's an inflection that my brain picks up or something in their voice. I don't know what does it, but it's, I can make humorous stories about it because for instance, one of the jobs that I was fired from, I had an argument with the guy that I worked with that I was a friend with. And he pulled me into the office and told me that he wanted to take me outside and give me an attitude adjustment. And I did not understand that the term attitude adjustment meant I want to smoke a bowl with you. So instead of going outside and smoking a bowl, I kicked the shit out of him. And so this statement says that I have the right to choose my own reality, and I'm choosing that reality by learning ways to live with that condition. I mean, there is medication that I can take that will numb that symptom, but it also severely affects the way my brain processes information. So I personally I find myself more productive to have that misinterpretive time happen 5 or 10% of the time. Yet it doesn't only affect me, it affects those around me, it affects people that I work with, possibly. And um, how do you reconcile that?
well, I guess in the same way that I think we, meaning human beings, cannot really, in my opinion, and I should have said that from the very beginning, anything I say is only my thoughts. I only have one perspective, and that's my own. So it's anything I say is coming first person, but anyway, so I don't think that there's a way for human beings to actually define a purely objective reality, meaning it is the way it is, and you know, because what we're talking about is social stuff. I mean, it's based on perception. It's not based on a factual science. So your reality may be different than the typical or average reality that a person has. And that makes it, I guess, different in a way that's recognizable and maybe, I guess, if it gets to that extent, unacceptable by the general understanding of reality. So, but if if the standard or average person has a reality that's more similar to yours, then it might not be unacceptable. Does that make sense? God, I mean, it sounds totally goofy, but
No, I hear what you're trying to say, but I think what I'm trying to get at is that regardless of whether or not somebody is misinterpreting reality, um, there is in fact an actual truth. And so when somebody is complimenting me and I think that they're coming after me instead, I am not I that is a false reality. That there's no way to deny that that is not true. So it's hard for me to reconcile that I have the right to have that. Does that make sense?
right, yeah. And I two things. First of all, just you know, the I guess extension of what you brought up from rap, kind of that aspect or that right to your own reality. The rest of that, and like you, I mean, I'm not quoting, I'm not looking at it, but
Right.
something to that effect. You have a right to your own reality as long as it doesn't harm somebody else or affect them negatively. So, um, I mean, for whatever reason, I wanted to say that. And then secondly, what I mean by no purely objective truth or reality is, for example, um, you got a red shirt on today. Um, I know what red is. For me, I know what it looks like. You may reliably call the exact same thing red that I do every time, but I cannot say with absolute certainty that you and I are seeing the exact same thing as red, even though we recognize it as the same, you know. And I don't know. Actually, a lot of women say that. Like my girlfriend tells me that I'm colorblind. You know, I mean, I think she and I have slightly different perspectives of red.
Especially when she's angry at
Right, exactly,
you.
exactly. Yeah,
I had to put that in there. She's a sweetheart. So I'm going to just ask you flat out because I have been asked this when I worked for you as a peer. on numerous
Yeah.
occasions, and I've been asked this since then when I have spoken about independent living philosophy. So I'm going to make the statement and allow you to say true or false and explain why. Okay? Independent living philosophy advocates that people with mental health issues not take medication.
Um, Again, speaking for myself, I would say independent living advocates, oh boy, that's a good question. Advocates that a person make the decision to do what is best for himself or herself. It's kind of a cop out, but that's reality.
So, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're not saying true or false. What you're saying is that that decision is up to the individual.
Yes,
Okay. And another foundation of independent living philosophy is personal responsibility.
correct.
And so, in conjunction with that, independent living philosophy would, and this is where RAP comes in, and this is where we can talk about RAP a little bit. Independent living philosophy also advocates that plans are. Let me just explain it the way you explained it to me years ago.
Okay.
Um, I'm sure you don't mind me saying this. People that can't see this already and don't know you, you are paralyzed from the neck down. Okay.
Yeah,
But if you wanted to go whitewater rafting, independent living philosophy says you have that right because
correct.
you have the right to experience what those without a disability. And somebody like myself would look at that and say, you're insane because if you fall off the raft, you know, you die.
Correct.
And your response to that is that as long as you're informed of the dangers and you take every precaution to mitigate those dangers, then that's okay. So explain how RAP works in that tying personal responsibility to that availability of self-determination.
How RAP does specifically?
Yeah, well, how independent living I RAP is different than independent living philosophy, but I believe that it's very well aligned with the fundamentals of independent living philosophy. And I guess for people that I mean, we're trying to crunch things that took me months of training into 45 minutes, and I guess the way to explain it would be most people in the mental health system understand IMR, in illness management and recovery, which takes a very medical model approach. Yes, Mahler, RAP is an acronym for Wellness Recovery Action Plan, and it's put together by the Copeland, is it Institute?
Copeland, Copeland Center.
Copeland Center. Um, so, and I don't know if you're familiar with illness management recovery, and it's similar to RAP, but it takes a more medical model disease approach, and RAP is more of an individualized, person centered approach. So, for those that don't understand RAP and do understand IMR, just explain how RAP fits into self determination.
I think I think rap rap is so uh embedded in exactly that self-determination that that's really the basis of it. And it goes back to what you were talking about in terms of reality. Um, you know, and I guess maybe an example is the best way to do it, but kind of the older way of dealing with mental health diagnoses was for people to be institutionalized and medicated, whether or not a person wanted to be medicated, and regardless of how the medication made that person feel. And so RAP just said, wait a minute, there's got to be a better way that looks, at least accounts for the way a person feels with a certain medication in a certain environment, and allows that person to make a decision about whether or not they want to feel that. And if they don't, and if not taking that medication negatively affects somebody else in a particular way, then RAP also expects that person to find an alternative way to prevent the negative effect on another person. It doesn't, I think that independent living and RAP really don't care whether a person is taking or is not taking medication. They care about what either taking the medication or not taking it does to affect another person. And it doesn't have to be, something aggressive or something egregious happening to another person. It might be somebody who the individual with the diagnosis loves the most. Their parent, their sibling, their husband or wife. Um, but if the person's behavior, because we're talking about behavioral health, if the person's behavior negatively affects another person, then he or she is perceived as doing something that's not good. Something maybe I shouldn't say wrong, but yeah, something that's wrong.
Interesting. So it really comes down to so long as a person is able to mitigate the negative consequences of one's symptoms, it doesn't necessarily mean that having those symptoms is bad.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think that's totally acceptable. And I think that goes back to independent living, which another core belief of independent living is that disability is um, a natural part of life. It just happens. And so, yes, symptoms are expected to happen and can acceptably happen. That's okay. Symptoms or behaviors of a condition can and do happen, but it's their effect that becomes problematic. And, you know, some people, myself included, as a younger person, and sometimes even now, I think, why does it matter what I do at all? Somebody shouldn't care, but, somebody else shouldn't care. But I need to think about what my behavior or whatever I am doing does to people who love me, you know? And that's important. Even if I'm not hurting somebody. Yeah, it shouldn't matter. But by doing whatever I'm doing, if it hurts my people who love me, then maybe I ought to think about what I'm doing.
So on that note, another, this isn't necessarily something that I've heard independent living philosophy wise. I don't think it's contrary to independent living philosophy, but I've heard this a lot in the mental health field that it's okay to be selfish when it comes to your own recovery. Meaning if something if a non-selfish choice is going to cause symptoms, it's okay to be selfish. That's the gist of that statement. But with what you just said, if taking that selfish action affects the people we love, even not necessarily, I mean, I'm not talking about like kicking your dog or anything like that. I'm talking about maybe, making your wife 15 minutes late for work or something. You know, it doesn't have to be a big deal. Um, what what's your response? That's
Um, well, it's interesting because again, personally, I think most actions in life are self, you know, even,
we've beat this one to death before.
yeah, I mean, the kindest thing that a person does really probably serves himself or herself more, you know. I think, yeah, and I probably told you this, but it's a guy who taught um, neuropsychology class that I took in my undergraduate. And he was talking about the behavior of animals and how it's really self promoting. Um, so, for example, anyone who's ever seen a prairie dog, for example, or a prairie dog town, right? They
Yep.
do the same thing. They walk up on a prairie dog town. There's 50 prairie dogs, and one of them is standing up as high as they can get and looking around and watching for danger. And, birds eat prairie dogs. So why is that prairie dog so stupid and standing up like that? The reality is, and this is evidence based, as I understand, the reality is that that prairie dog consistently is the least reproductively uh, capable animal in the group. But that prairie dog's offspring are part of that group. So by standing up like that, the prairie dog is purposefully allowing itself to be sacrificed so that its more productive offspring have a higher chance of surviving and reproducing more than that prairie dog could anyway. So I don't know, that's kind of a,
That's it makes sense, you know.
so then the question is, does altruism exist? You know, probably when I think about the, in my opinion, the nicest things that I've ever done in my life, um, I remember them because of how good they make me feel. Which is funny because I go back to childhood conversations with my mom, who used to say things like, and probably many of us have heard this, you know, that the true part about Christmas is in the giving. And I'm like,
Yeah.
heck with that. Give to
Yeah.
me,
Yeah.
you know. But think about the gifts that make you, or at least that have made me feel the best, have been things I've gifted to somebody else, which is why I remember them, because it made me feel good. So, yeah, in what situation is there true altruism? I don't know.
I don't know either, man. But I want to ask you one more question before
Okay.
we before we take a quick break to get coffee, and then we'll open it up to any questions that may have. But it goes to self determination, and it also, I'm asking you as a mental health professional, um, and I need to be sure to ask this properly. Um, I I think in our local community, this is not a majority of mental health providers anymore. I think that our community that you and I live in is a little bit more progressive in terms of mental health treatments than some people that I meet in other parts of the country or other parts of the world, even. And so the question revolves around the words self determination and compliance non compliance. So, independent living philosophy allows for the right of self determination to decide whether or not to be medicated. And there, I still believe in the world that in the majority of mental health providers, they view it as a disease model that is fixable or not fixable. And if the person who comes to them for their professional opinion feels differently than them, then they write in their chart non compliant, and that has effects that are far reaching to that individual. So, as a mental health professional who advocates for independent living philosophy as strongly as you do, how do you reconcile that?
Uh, I ask myself that every day. Um, and I don't know that I have. I don't know that I've found something that allows me to be okay with it. And I'm still trying to figure that out. Um, because one part that really scares me about the situation I'm in right now is that uh the education I've had and the license that I happen to have, which is recognized, and you know that allows me to assign a diagnosis, which means attach a label, and that label is recognized by uh, insurances and other paying sources, etc. But it scares me because from the second I do that until for the rest of a person's life, going back to what we said about disability being defined as something that exists or having a history of existing, as soon as I, as a person, assign that label, which in fact I have not done to date. But from the time that I do that, a person cannot escape that label. From that moment on, that
Without
person,
somebody else changing that diagnosis. Is that
right,
okay?
but they can't eliminate it. They can't pretend like it never happened.
Right.
So, so in other words, philosophically and realistically speaking, for the rest of that person's life, he or she lives in a constant state of recovery, meaning that that person's doing whatever they need to do to address the diagnosis, or they're non-compliant. And if part of what a professional has said allows them to function the best with that diagnosis, if part of that includes taking medication and they're not taking medication, then they're considered non-compliant. That scares me to death.
So how to change
I,
that? How
oh
to change that attitude?
boy, if I had that, man, I would be, uh, I don't know. I, I, I don't know, Brian. Uh,
Let me just essentially rephrase what you just said. Um, a person who has a situational depression makes a suicide attempt and is put into the hospital and meets with the psychiatrist for 15 minutes. And that psychiatrist writes down in their chart bipolar disorder. And 15 years later, that person, regardless of whether that was a correct diagnosis or not, that person has to follow treatment regimens for that diagnosis or they are considered a rebel. You know, they're they're refusing treatment, like they're leaving the hospital against medical advice. I mean, it's that serious of an offense in terms of how insurance companies, benefit agencies look at that decision.
that's my understanding. I do see that. Uh, I, I, I also understand that that same doctor can change his or her uh, prognosis, meaning that same psychiatrist might see the same person in a different condition and say that that medication is no longer needed. And so, but
But
as long
but
as
15, 20 years has gone by and that psychiatrist that the person met for 15 minutes is dead. You know, it's um my own experience and the experience that I have heard with other people in the mental health field is that that diagnosis never changes. It just shit just keeps getting piled on. Oh no, you're no, it's not bipolar disorder. It's schizoaffective disorder. No, it's attention deficit disorder. And you just, I mean, I as a mental health patient have more letters behind my name than you do as a mental health professional. You know, and I'm making light of it, but it's not something to really be made light of because when it comes down to it, 2/3 of all that shit was situational to begin with and not in any way an illness. So it it's interesting to me to see a peer slash behavioral mental health model that is, and we haven't really even talked about how successful um, the the peer network in our state has been, and how they've implemented peer support programs in communities that have resulted in less police calls, less arrests, and I mean the amount of money spent on these programs versus the amount of money that it saves only in the salary of police officers, it's already offset. And that doesn't mention all the other stuff. So when how much further do we have to go before that's the dominant model, I guess? As a mental health professional, nationwide speaking, what do you see 10 years out?
You know, I actually believe that we're seeing a shift right now, currently, because of what we're all experiencing worldwide. Um, Number one, you're talking about a situational diagnosis. Um, you know, look at what's happening and what has happened with COVID in the last, uh, you know, 10 months. Um, and, I jokingly have said several times in recent months um, that if somebody's not experiencing some type of adjustment disorder or anxiety based on the effects of COVID, they're not paying attention. Um, but I'm serious about that. I mean, it's it's scary, I think, and so because of that, there's been more attention to the need of mental health resources to help people with those types of things. And to meet that need of more demand, uh, at least what I've been aware of, has focused a lot on um, peer support. Um, and then, secondly, in terms of what we've been seeing, uh, again worldwide, but what we're most aware of in our country is um, civil unrest. And civil unrest, at least to my knowledge, has been um, mitigated by a social approach rather than a professional approach. Um, yeah,
But that's also very dependent upon the community that that's happening in.
right, yep,
It 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 it's very. I mean, even federal programs like SSDI, it depends on the judge of the district for many people, and that judge is appointed by different political ideologies, and so what constitutes a disability in Washington may not be judged a disability in Florida. And so that's I mean that's a problem we could discuss for hours, but you know, I think what I want to do, Chris, is take like a 5 minute break, fill up my coffee, and anybody that's in chat that's been listening that has any questions, um, let's fire away. Let's put Chris on the hot seat, and this is the first time I've actually actually interviewed somebody, so I don't think I got 2/3 of what I wanted to get across.
Yeah.
But maybe with these guys asking questions, that will fill in the holes that I didn't get across. So we'll be back in about 5 minutes and do a little 15-minute, 30-minute question answer session, depending on what questions people have. Cool.
Okay.
All right, I'll see you in 5.
Okay.
All right, dude, we're about ready to go back on. Just let me know when you're ready. Do you hear me? You're muted. There you go. I didn't even notice. It's no biggie. Totally no biggie. But 2/3 of the people that are there know me as, well, they don't know me as Brian, but they know that my name's Brian. There's actually some people that I expected to come by that haven't shown up, so they're probably going to watch the video on demand. So I don't anticipate that we're going to get a lot of questions. So we'll probably just finish, bullshitting for 15, 20 more minutes and then call it good. Okay, cool. All right, we're heading back. All right, guys, thanks for hanging out with us today. Somehow Chris is no longer showing up on screen. Let me see why that is. There we go. Weird. I have to resize you. There we go. You're kind of blurry and shit now, but I don't know why. We'll call it good though. So let's see. We have a question here. Um, the one question I have is around diagnosis. If someone is deemed to have a certain condition, say in 1970, what avenues exist today to eliminate that diagnosis, considering it's likely dated? I mean, there were conditions in the past that were treated with being lobotomized, but today that would be ludicrous. What is being done to remove incorrect diagnoses?
Um,
That's a
well,
really good question.
that's a great question.
Yeah.
Um, so I think, um, I think the diagnosis cannot be removed, just totally eliminated as if it never happened. But a person could be reevaluated and and, and I guess I would wonder about what the reason is. I don't know if maybe the person wants to see the elimination of that diagnosis because of the way maybe the diagnosis makes him or her feel, or if it negatively affects the person in employment or retirement or in any other way. I don't know. I would wonder what the reason is because I think a person could, um, if they wanted to, kind of at least stop the trail of that diagnosis from following by changing providers, for example, and not reporting it and just basically treating it like it didn't ever happen. Um, and I may be wrong, but that's my understanding of it.
Well, let's think of it in a different with a different diagnosis because doctors make incorrect diagnoses all the time about things unrelated to mental health all the time. So, let's say emergency room doctor, 12-year-old just got out of high school makes a diagnosis about, you know, a person having diabetes, let's just say. And the person is given insulin, um, and it produces a negative effect because they don't have diabetes. They just had a situational sugar problem when that inexperienced doctor saw them. So, certainly, 2 years down the road, when that's discovered by another doctor, that doctor can say, yes, that person does not have diabetes without having to go back to the original diagnostic doctor to negate that diagnosis. Is that different in the mental health model?
Mm, uh, I, I guess I don't know. I don't know an absolute answer to that. And and I think it would depend partially on whatever board or uh, whatever entity of behavioral health is recognizing the diagnosis.
Okay, so when you were asking, it would depend on why the person's concerned about the diagnosis.
Yeah,
What it is coming from an insurance company. I'm very aware that a diagnosis, especially if it's being seen as a pre-existing condition, may lead to coverages being declined because insurance companies never forget. And and that's right now covered under the Affordable Care Act, but of course that's in limbo, you know. I mean, that goes back to the discussion about laws earlier. You know, just because it's law today doesn't mean it's going to be law tomorrow. So that is a very legitimate question.
Absolutely. Um, and yeah, so taking that perspective from an insurance company, um, I believe if that diagnosis is on paper and on record in connection with a particular individual, it's pretty hard to escape. Um, I mean, the person could change providers, but then it would take a total shift of pretty much existence to be able to escape that. Um, and that person's exactly right that insurances don't forget. But boy, I mean, a person would have to go to some pretty extreme lengths. Name change, reassign social security number, etc. I mean, change the entire existence. Um,
Which is doable, but it's a huge pain in the ass,
right, yeah, yeah.
you know.
Um, and that brings me back again to how scary it is to think about assigning a diagnosis, you know? I mean, that's wow.
So I'd be surprised if the ACA ever covers a large portion of those costs for mental health. Private insurances are those that will dictate how coverage is provided, in my opinion, which is dictated by pre existing diagnosis. And I think I don't. I don't know enough about the Affordable Care Act, to be honest, to even know about what pre existing conditions are covered or what is dictated has to be covered and how. Um, but we're the person that is asking the question works as an underwriter for a private health insurance company.
Mm,
So we're we are getting an accurate industry representation of how
absolutely.
insurance views mental health issues.
Mm,
Um, so, and that's to be honest, I've never really even thought of it from that perspective. I've always thought of it from the perspective of um, being treated properly. You know, if you have an incorrect diagnosis, you're going to, you know, if you are diagnosed with a chemical imbalance, a perpetual chemical imbalance in your brain, when really what is happening is that it's not perpetual, it's just a situational issue that caused a chemical imbalance, and you treat that as a chronic issue, there are consequences to that individual that are not necessary. And the problem isn't so the medical model in mental health, as I understand it, has to be in place in order for mental health providers to be covered by insurances. There, there is no reason for an insurance company to provide treatment for somebody with depression if they don't carry a diagnosis of depression. Um, Mahler says it's tough. Your best coverage of those conditions will come from private insurers, and an outdated diagnosis could eliminate coverage in some cases.
You know, I wonder, and maybe your viewer can answer this, but so if somebody incorrectly diagnosed with a particular condition doesn't actually have that condition, nor need to be treated for that condition, then it seems to me that it's okay that the insurance company denies coverage of that condition as a pre-existing condition because it exists when the person came. But if they don't need it treated anyway, then I'm not sure why it really matters.
Well, I think what he's getting at, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mahler, I think what he's trying to get at is, for instance, um, if there is a diagnosis of bipolar disorder and that is inaccurate, it was made as a diagnosis during a situational depression, and 10 years has passed, and another situational depression occurs, that potentially has the ability to not be covered because of the bipolar disorder diagnosis. Am I getting that right, Mahler? And we're going to have to wait for him to
Yeah.
reply.
No, and I was, as I was saying that, I was thinking the same thing. But I think what was going through my mind was, okay, let's say person's incorrectly diagnosed with bipolar, so they really don't need to be treated, but it exists as a pre-existing condition. The insurance company will not pay for whatever it is to treat it.
So,
Down the road, down the road, the person experiences major depression and is diagnosed as major depression and needs some services for that. I and like you said, you don't know exactly, down to the gnat's ass what the ACA would say, but does the existence of a bipolar diagnosis historically or a pre-existing condition prevent services to treat a separate diagnosis of major depression? And I would think not.
I think you're right about that, and that is precisely why letters keep getting stacked onto people, because they're exhibiting another reaction to a different kind of trauma that has manifested different symptoms. And um you know and Mahler's replying that it would be possible to be paid for, but you would have to fill out extra paperwork and whatnot, and that causes additional stress, and a person in those conditions are unable to follow through with that. And I've personally had experience with that in terms of the Family Medical Leave Act, where yes, it is law that if I have a depressive episode that causes me a temporary disability, my company has to allow for that recovery. And yes, that's 100% true. But they can also require that I fill out 300 fucking pages of bullshit in order to get that. And in that condition, a person can't do that. So, what's the solution? Is there a solution?
Right. And honestly, I don't think there is, because I also think of um, situations where a business or an organization, even a nonprofit, uh, with a board of directors or whatever, has a policy, for example, that an employee must do a particular thing. So let's say you work for an organization, they have a policy that you know, you have sick leave or earn sick leave, and you're able to take that if you are ill. But in order to use more than, for example, 2 consecutive days, in order for you to come back to work, you need a doctor's order. So if somebody gets a cold and doesn't feel good for 2 days and stays home, which is good because they don't make everybody else sick anyway, they then have the burden and expense of seeking out a doctor, seeing the doctor, and paying the doctor to write a statement that says they're well enough to go back to work. And then, I'm sure attorneys right now are up to their necks in helping employers figure out policies and ways to address how do we handle absences for this new thing called
Right.
COVID-19.
Yep. Absolutely.
Crazy.
So did we answer that for you, Mahler? Is that do you have a follow up at all with that?
And thank Mahler, by the way, for the information.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. He appreciates the feedback, he says. And I think that was an excellent question. Um,
yeah,
and I've never even really considered that because um, personally that's never come up for me yet. And it may come up at one point, but um I personally am more concerned from my own experiences and from many of the people that I worked with. Um, so you remember the cookie guy,
yeah,
okay? And I don't I don't know I know very little about autism spectrum disorder. But
yeah,
but you and I both agree that that was what he probably struggled with. But as I understand it, you can't be diagnosed with autism past a certain age. And what it ends up being called if you're diagnosed with it as an adult is undiagnosed autism. Is that
it usually, I believe it would be some kind of personality disorder. I mean, something like social adjustment disorder.
rather than being autism spectrum
Correct. Yeah.
issues?
Yep.
But the symptoms that he exhibited, if he were 5 years old, he would most likely have been diagnosed somewhere on the autism spectrum.
Correct.
Okay. So that seems to me that he's been given a disservice by the mental health professional community in the sense that if you treat somebody that has the flu for chicken pox, they're not going to feel better. And if you treat somebody with a social adjustment disorder or a social anxiety disorder that has, well, it's probably similar. I mean, we're talking about behavioral treatments, so rather than medical treatments. Um, so I don't necessarily think the diagnosis would affect the quality of the treatment, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because other institutions also, for example, require, uh, for example, Montana's state definition for developmental disability, um, which, typically affects someone's cognition, etc., must be diagnosed prior to age 18. You know, maybe it wasn't recognized until later in life.
Right.
I don't know, but to meet the state definition, yeah, it's got to be diagnosed as a juvenile.
That's just bizarre to me.
Yeah, well, I think it's outdated anyway. Or oh, never mind. I was gonna say because of some of the language, but I think the language has changed.
I think we're on the verge of positive change.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
I think that, um, and we really didn't get into much about peer support.
No.
Um,
Mm.
it's it's had astounding, successful, documented successes in multiple locations around the country. So we're not talking about something that's theoretical. And when it comes down to it, we're not really talking about something that costs John Q taxpayer.
Sorry, I just gotta turn the fan off.
No worries, man. So, and I know, it's getting to be 10:30. I know you have an appointment at 11, so we should.
Well, I just gotta shut this off. Okay, got it. Um, no, yes, just a minute ago, um, you referred to peer support as being something that, as you said, doesn't have to cost taxpayers money.
Right.
I was just gonna add to that. And you mentioned it briefly earlier, but yes, peer support has been proven, evidence-based proven, to save taxpayers money, to cost them less money. So not only not add expenses, but remove current expenses. And that happens because things like emergency responders and etc. that are paid for by taxes cost a lot more in response to a mental health crisis than does someone who is providing peer support. And the peer support may be far more effective. And I think we're going to start to see that happening more and more. Uh, in fact, in this area and regionally, what I've heard them respond to are what are called um, mobile response units. So, and unit is a group of people, small group of people that represents a peer, somebody with lived mental health experience, and uh, some type of mental health professional, and a social worker. Um, so that somebody calls 911 in the event that a mental health crisis occurs. And instead of sending police and paramedics in vehicles that are paid for by taxpayers, so salaries, benefits, vehicles, etc., at a much higher rate than is this mobile response unit, which is a group of people that responds often far more appropriately than the emergency responders.
Right. They're not carrying tasers.
Right, that's an awesome thing.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I have fortunately not been tased, but
yeah,
I have some friends that are very experienced with the taser, and um, I understand sometimes that's necessary, but I also understand that oftentimes it can be de-escalated. And I've even seen it happen on Twitch where um, in somebody's mental health stream where somebody comes in and they're feeling depressed and about a situation, and the streamer has 70 people in their audience, so he can't single out every person. People within that community will reach out to that person and say, hey, when I was in your shoes, blah 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 blah. And that's really what we're talking about. When you have that kind of connection, that's very different than somebody who has never. It's empathy versus sympathy. When you have that empathetic connection, there's a already from the get-go of the de-escalation, there's already a credibility established that doesn't exist in a doctor-patient relationship, a police officer suspect relationship, or an emergency responder patient relationship.
although it can, you said doesn't exist, but it can
It could.
because because mental health diagnoses happen to medical professionals,
Sure.
police officers, paramedics,
Absolutely.
etc. So they're true. Yeah, they're
And
definitely.
that's,
But
I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying that just because somebody is a police officer, they're trigger happy and ready to tase people with mental
right,
mental
yeah,
health issues. I don't believe that
no,
at all. Um, that's not even close to where I'm going with this. What I'm saying is that a police car with two officers in it costs less money than, along with the ambulance, the paramedics, the emergency room doctors, the emergency room bed, the possible institutionalization for a couple weeks, all of that costs exponentially more than the social worker, the mental health professional, and the peer driving out there and just sitting down with the guy and talking him through it.
yeah, yeah.
So
No, I
I
agree.
think I think that's a good place to kind of wrap it up. Um,
Okay.
I think if some interest is shown, maybe a month or two from now we can do one that's more specific, just on peer support.
Yeah,
Because I still don't think we really got into that as much as I wanted to cover. But as is typical when you and I try to work, we tend to bullshit a little bit too. So,
yeah,
although I think we did pretty damn good this time, as far as I think we got at least 2/3 of our time we got work done, And,
Yeah.
usually that's, if we get 20% of our time work done, we're, we're hitting good. So I appreciate that. And I want to say thanks to everybody that came out and listened and participated. And Mahler, that was a flippin' awesome question, man. I appreciate that.
That was great.
Yeah. Um, so this next Friday, the 13th, Friday the 13th, um, I'm having a colleague of ours, Lori, on to discuss independence and gratitude and how that fits into independent living philosophy and mental health issues. So, and I know that Lori's also a rap facilitator, and I might ask her a question or two about rap while I have her on the line. So,
See if she correct. See if she can correct me.
yeah, I bet she can. She knows everything about everything about. Yeah, I appreciate thanks, Mahler, but really I appreciate the I appreciate your participation. That was awesome.
Yeah.
Um, so Friday the 13th, 1 o'clock is the next Peer Talk interview, and I hope to see you all at that. Chris, just hang out 1 second while I change to the end screen, and I'll finish up with you. But
Okay.
the rest of you guys, thanks for hanging out, sending hugs, and we will see you on the next stream. Have a wonderful afternoon.